Welcome to Discovery Tour by Assassin's Creed, Ancient Egypt. Welcome to Alexandria, planning of the city. Alexander's plan to build his great city began with a verse from Homer's Odyssey. There is, in front of Egypt, in the sea with many swells, an island called Pharos. Guided by these clues, Alexander the Great founded his future city at the western end of the Nile Delta. Though Alexander considered this location ideal for his great city, it presented considerable challenges. The Great Walls of Alexandria had a humble beginning. Lacking chalk to outline the future city, excavations led by Mahmud Bey el-Falaki in the 19th century revealed that the wall enclosure measured approximately 5.2 kilometers. These formidable ancient walls would resist a number of attacks, including fending off the king of Syria in 169 BCE. It wasn't until 295 CE that they eventually fell to Roman Emperor Diocletian, and this only after 8 months of relentless assault. Alexandria's principal architect, Dinocrates, chose a Hippodamian grid plan. The grid maximized functionality, with wide, straight roads and canals running beneath them.
Whoa.
A central corridor ran from the Mediterranean's north port down to Lake Mareotis to the south. This thoroughfare Alexandria was most likely built upon an already existing Egyptian village. Upon its completion, the Egyptians reviled the city, refusing to call it by its founder's name. Instead, they called it Raked, the building, as a mark of disdain, which was later Hellenized into Rakotis. Despite this, the name Alexandria would remain.
Oh, whoa! Yeah.
Welcome to Osiris, the first mummy. The oldest mummies recovered date from the Old Kingdom, though Egyptologists believe that mummification was in use much earlier than that. At first, the body was mummified through environmental desiccation, by leveraging the dryness of the environment and the heat of the... Ideologically, the will to preserve the body is not explained in any way until 3600 BCE. This is when the Egyptian belief that the body housed the soul was finally documented for modern Egyptologists to eventually decipher. It was not until the arrival of the myth of Osiris in the Egyptian religion around the 5th dynasty that Osiris was mainly known as the god of the dead and the god of resurrection. The most well-known Genesis myth it is Plutarch who gives the most simplified and complete summary of the story. Within Egyptian mythology, Osiris represented the first king to rule Egypt. Jealous of his power, his brother Seth attempted to usurp his throne. After several unsuccessful attempts, Seth succeeded in killing his brother by dismembering him and scattering the pieces of his body all over Egypt. Isit, the great of magic, traveled all over. Isit then reassembled the body of her husband by binding it together with strips of linen. Aided by her sister Nephthys, another powerful. The ritual used to bring Osiris back to life essentially depicts how he became the first mummy. It is why, on the sarcophagi of kings, we often find Isit and Nephthys represented as the magicians who restore life to the deceased.
Welcome to Mummies of Ancient Egypt. The mummification process used by ancient Egyptians was highly ceremonial in nature. The different types of The purification of the body began with a libation from... After taking care of the brain, canopic jars were placed towards the middle of the New Kingdom. Embalmers used natron as a desiccant to dry the... In addition to... Masks were an important part of a mummy's... Cartonnage evolved. Once the mummy was properly wrapped and... The last stage of this long ritual was the act of touching the mouth with the adze to symbolically allow the breath of life to infuse an inert body. Its performance was reserved for a very specific set of people: priests who wore the mask of the god Anubis, a close relative of the family, or by the heir to the throne.
Welcome to The Importance of Mummies. The first hieroglyph for... The mummification techniques were jealously guarded by embalmers from generation to generation. The Uabet, the least Egyptian civilization. The Egyptomania phenomenon was heralded by Napoleon Bonaparte's... By 1868, mass tourism began in Egypt. Thanks to those dubious parties, the fantasy of a mummy coming back to life, seeking revenge on its defilers, was born. The mummy malediction myth has remained steady in popular culture ever since, particularly in written media and cinema.
Welcome to Amulets and Rituals. Ancient Egyptians believed that priests, religion. There was a complete calendar of each of the religious days, both good and bad, illustrating the appropriate daily rituals. Along with wine, milk, and ointments, offerings to the gods consisted of small amulets to life-size statues and family shrines. During the Greco-Roman period, offerings to the gods consisted of mummified animals, cats for Bastet, dogs for Anubis, and birds for Thoth. Deemed messengers of the gods, it was oracles that guided the Greek sailor Batos to the coast of Libya, where he founded a colony known as Cyrene. During Alexander the Great's campaign to conquer Persia, he consulted the oracle at the Temple of Amun within the oasis of Siwa, and was subsequently ordained a divine being. Welcome to Temples and... During rituals and festivals, ancient Egyptians believed that Ra, the sun god, the god Ra believed mankind was conspiring against him. He ordered Sekhmet, the lion-headed war god. Unlike the daily rituals that took place, the importance of these festivals is demonstrated by their... The temple high scribes were custodians of the sacred sciences. Priests and all the officials who served the temple worked only 3 months a year, with each period separated by a quarter of inactivity, at least within the temple compound. Each outgoing group handed over the temple and their tools to the newcomers. Only the high priesthood remained in permanent office. The most sacred part, the naos, was where the pharaohs and their priests often chose the site.
Welcome to Temples and Priests. From its foundation, the city... Temples were the center of religious, political, and economic life in ancient Egypt. These Located in the center of Memphis, the Temple of Ptah was the most prominent and imposing building in the city. The long walkway leading toward the temple, the dromos opened into a courtyard with a surrounding portico graced with columns carved to resemble palm trees. During special festivals, the general population was allowed to enter this location, but under no circumstances would they be allowed into the sacred spaces beyond the courtyard. The size of the imposing sculpture reflects the importance it had to the temple during. In Egyptian culture, some animals were associated with gods, while others were considered to be living gods. Originally the symbol of fertility, the Apis bull lived with its harem in a sacred barn located in an enclosure in the Temple of Ptah. Each bull bore 20. Like other living divinities, the mortal incarnation of the Apis bull was prayed to, and when it died, it was given a luxurious funeral. Ancient Egyptians believed that temple rituals were essential to maintain detail. The high priest, the god was then washed with incense. Heredity was the high priest. In the 21st, the educational institution in ancient Egypt, not limited to instruction for young students, the House of Life was a source of reference for many scholars, with rooms dedicated to papyri of many disciplines. Ancient Egyptian economy was based. There are records of pharaohs. Palaces, warehouses, and granaries were built inside the temple compound to better control the There are records of Welcome to Building Ancient Egypt. Constructed with bricks made of limestone was common. Ancient Egyptians preferred. Workers would draw a large grid directly on the stone surface. To cut the stone, to maintain the stability of these mining pits over the course of quarters. In every quarry, dedicated shrines were established to offer protection for the workers. To cut the stone, they created a longitudinal kerf, or slit, and then cut the rock at a 90-degree angle. The lower side was determined along the geological layers or by using a horizontal cut. Wooden wedges were inserted in the rock and hammered in. Shock waves were then generated using hammers.
Welcome to Workers. Whether workers were employed for the archaeology, while some quarries were closed, Whenever possible, during floods, the Uwadi stone cargo generally weighed 15 tons per boat. River transportation was the most efficient way to ferry stone blocks between the quarry and the construction site. Stone cargo. Welcome to Agriculture and Seasons. While crops were cultivated in different oases around the desert, most of the arable lands were near the Ptolemaic era created an agricultural revolution with the introduction of advanced agricultural techniques and new grain types such as rice, durum wheat, and pearl millet. The resulting agricultural mass production greatly increased. Both bread and beer rations were part of a system of barter payment. The state used those goods to pay wages for those who worked in the quarries and at the construction sites. Beer was so important to ancient Egyptians. In order to increase agricultural production, fertile land was divided into plots and large agricultural villages were encouraged. The state and temples were the biggest landowners. Depending on the region, fertile land was managed by civil servants or rented to individuals. The three seasons known as Akhet, Peret, and Shemu corresponded to a specific phase of the agricultural process and the river's natural changes. Akhet was the time of the flood, beginning with the appearance of the star Sirius in July. Peret was the time when lands were cultivated, plowed, and sown. This fell between October and November. The pharaoh's duty was to uphold order against chaos and provide for his people. Priests and local governors also wanted to appear as protectors of the people. However, any variation in the Nile's seasons could cause water shortages. This had devastating consequences on wheat and barley crops. The pharaoh, administrators, and priests knew they needed to demonstrate. The story begins with the pharaoh worried for his people. The Nile hasn't flooded in years, and his people are starving. In search of the origins of the flooding, Djoser seeks out Khnum, the protector god of the region and the source of the drought. Djoser gives the god offerings and orders his priests to restore the temple of Khnum. These offerings please the god, and the floods are restored. This story was intended to highlight the importance of the deity in everyone's daily lives, while also demonstrating the crucial role that the priests and the king played in feeding and protecting the people of Egypt.
Welcome to Ancient Egyptian Culture. The new grain types of the Ptolemaic period required later a sakia, or water. The threshing process separated the grain from its husk. Workers would spread the... Winnowing was the stage where workers used Transporting large amounts of grain required ships equipped to... Having reached Alexandria's inner harbor, the wheat was unloaded under the supervision of a civil servant in charge of wheat management. Portions were distributed to Alexandria's city market. Grain storage facilities were located across all of Egypt. Temples and institutes. The sieves used by ancient Egyptians were unable to filter out sand and...
Welcome to Domesticated Animals of Ancient Egypt. Agriculture and domesticated livestock were introduced 6,000 years ago. Pets were deeply cherished in ancient Egypt. Many illustrations of children often include a pet in the depiction.
Yeah. نجخرت.
One of ancient Egypt's most iconic animals, the cat, wasn't adopted into their daily life until the Middle Kingdom. Since they were so highly capable of killing snakes and rodents, the earliest reference to dogs dates back to 5000 BCE. They were popular pets as they helped hunters and protected herds. They were closely linked to Anubis, the jackal-headed god. Baboons, monkeys, and even falcons were tamed as pets. Each was mummified and buried with as much ceremony as any family member.
Welcome to Ancient Egyptian Medicine. Evidence of advance. Another similar document. Remedies were considered as medicine and carried by doctors and priests. Village doctors often had enough.
Welcome to Leather and Linen in Ancient Egypt. Tanning, a process which dates from prehistoric times, was present although not highly valued in Egypt due to the heat. Leather was reserved mainly for things such as sandals, leather bags, dagger sheaths, quivers, and other similar items. Leopard hides, unlike regular leather, were highly valued and usually worn by priests. Valued for its coolness and freshness in hot weather, linen was the fiber most commonly used for fabrics and textiles. It was produced from flax, which was plentiful in Egypt. Fibers were usually dyed before weaving, while color was used in the production of textiles. Various shades were achieved using woad, a dye produced from the leaves of Isotis tinctoria. This area's style is strongly influenced by the dye baths and tanneries of modern-day Fes in Morocco. Welcome to Ancient Egyptian Fashions. Learning what life was like for ancient Egyptians present jewelry was, though ideal, the fabric of ancient Egyptian clothing, cosmetics including Egyptians believed kohl had magical powers, wearing it as black eyeliner to protect their eyes from the sun. Women and teenage girls wore their hair wigs. Prepubescent children generally had their heads shaved. Young girls kept some strands intact, while welcome to Artisan. It was under the watchful eye of Ta of art. In ancient Egyptian culture, drawing was used as illustration, such as seen in the Book of the Dead. It was also the first step in the creation of a relief, painting, or statue. Two-dimensional representations were concerned with order and form, and were intended to honor gods and promote the transition of the soul to the afterlife. Stylistically, Egyptians were concerned with the depiction of the human form's inner self. As such, artistic representations were not concerned with realism, but rather with idealized youth and perfectly harmonious visuals. An exception to this were scenes. Reliefs could be. Statues were believed to be vessels for the soul. In ancient. At the domestic level, most Egyptians were craftspeople to a greater or lesser extent. The ability to repair tools was a daily necessity. Crafted everyday items could also be bartered for at the. Located near the Valley of the Kings, Deir el-Medina. Archaeologists believe the site was home to skilled and respected artisans for over 400 years. Statues were believed to be vessels for the souls of the deceased, or deities. That is why a sculptor was called the one who makes it live. This divine duty earned them the utmost respect. As with a relief, creation of a sculpture began with a drawing. Most statues were made of quarried blocks of stone, primarily limestone, though sometimes harder stones such as quartzite were also used.
Welcome to Evolution of Excavations all over Egypt. Early pots. The potter's wheel was utilized during the Old Kingdom. Pottery became smoother and more polished, similar to river stones. It was decorated primarily in red pigment, with the black color achieved by exposing it to smoke. Pottery workshops were attached to palaces or temples, and around the late period, specialized workshops began to appear. Quartzite particle. Potsherds could be found anywhere and were the most common canvas for writing or drawing, in comparison to the more expensive papyrus sheets. Named after their Greek description, ostraca contained daily life records, letters, or could be drawn upon. Artists drew sketches for temples and tombs, or simply for leisure.
Welcome to... In pre-Greco-Roman culture, women were considered... Certain professions were open only to women, such as weaving or Homes were generally composed of 3 rooms. Marriages were a social contract rather than a religious construct. Family was vitally important to ancient Egyptians, and children were considered a blessing from the gods. The father, mother, and their children were the nucleus of the family, and cohabitation sometimes extended. Status and wealth played a large... Town officials and the rich lived in mansions with numerous rooms that were luxuriously decorated. Funeral stone inscriptions focused on the main member of a household. Encircling this person would then be a spouse, parents, and children. Town officials and The rich lived in mansions with numerous rooms that were luxuriously decorated. Only temples and tombs meant to last for all eternity were built with stone. My kingdom for a glass of water? Welcome to Bread and... While the Mesopotamians invented beer, including using a straw to avoid the sediments and herbs, ancient Egyptians perfected the brewing method. Egyptian beer's quality was determined by alcohol strength, color, and flavor. During the Pharaonic era, beer was the most commonly used. Beer was the popular recipe. Once baked, bread would be crumbled into the brew to... Once ready, the bread and grain mixture was compressed, and then food was prepared. Dough. Ancient.
Welcome to Wine in... When the god a millennia-old tradition. Grape cultivation and wine production was regimented. Documentation shows that only certain craftsfolk were allowed to provide the containers required to store and transport wine. Egyptians had different kinds of wines, most of which ranged in quality from good to very good. Welcome to Oil in Ancient Egypt. Castor, sesame, and moringa were the source of the most common oils in ancient Egypt. Oil. Ancient Egyptians originally used castor oil in wick lamps, but also for cosmetics, such as facial and hair treatments. There is mention in some papyrus of castor oil being prescribed. Olive trees were present, though scarce, in ancient Egypt's early history, and olives were mostly imported from Syria and Palestine. Their use and cultivation remained uncommon until the mass arrival of Greek settlers during the reign of the Ptolemies, when demand increased sharply. Olive trees were normally found in the region of the Fayum and the lands surrounding Alexandria.
نجحر. هي
Ku hati tahem seje
Yeah. Ah. Oh. Oh. Harry. Oh. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. Hey. Hey, hey,